Hi, guys. Welcome to another Monday night study. We've been going through the Book of Enoch, and we're back to it tonight. We've got through these first 5 points, and now we're heading into point number 6, the shepherd's prophecy. It's also called the prophecy of the animals and shepherds. And it's chapters 85 to 90. We're going to divide it into 3 pieces so you can clearly see, number 1, how the prophecy works, the symbols, and then how it comes up to the things that happen up to 70 or 135 AD, actually. And then the thing that is the part for our time period, because there's a gap, as it is in most prophecies. So when we look at this chapters 85 to 90, what it's going to be is he has a dream. Let me remind you the first dream. The first dream is basically just that there is a destruction of the world by water, and then afterwards by fire, but same kind of a situation. That dream was more literal. He just went outside in the dream and saw everything get completely destroyed by this flood of water. So in this case, it's more symbolic, as dreams usually are. So we're going to start with Adam and go forward to the creation of Israel and the temple, and then the destruction of Israel in 70 AD, the temple rather, and then 135 is the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And it's really interesting to see these. And then we're going to look at, in a detailed amount of the kings, and then the last part. So the first part I want to draw your attention to is just the symbolism, what it is. And a lot of people will say that this is fake, or it's been altered, edited. Obviously, it's been retranslated. So place names are more modern than they were anciently. But in this case, what we're going to see is that if it was a fake prophecy, and they say this about Daniel a lot, Daniel is, there's no way it could have been written by Daniel because the prophecies are way too accurate. So it had to have been written by somebody in the Maccabean time period to lie and say they were Daniel, to give the people some false hope so that they can attack and take over the world. And it didn't work, and they all died. And, that's basically what the liberals tend to say. And we've looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls. The prophecies are very specific. Daniel is very, very specific. And there's evidence that the entire book, very credible evidence, was written back in the 5th century BC. So no way around that. And then, of course, when Daniel doesn't stop with the Maccabean prophecies and goes all the way up to the ships of Rome coming, Rome destroying the temple, and then the other things that happened, no one in the Maccabean period could have accurately predicted the destruction of the temple by the Romans. So, and in either case, it has to be real prophecy. We're going to see the same thing in this one prophecy of Enoch. And I want to build on these and eventually pull together all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Church Father comments, and Bible prophecies, and paint a really good picture for us to look, things that we want to look for in the end times. So let's go ahead and start this. We're going to probably cover not quite half of it, but like I say, we're going to break this up into thirds. So here is the first part of it. This is chapter 85, and it's the second dream. You'll remember he said, I had 2 dreams. He's telling his son Methuselah. One, when I was real little, just beginning to learn to write. That was the dream about the destruction of the world by fire. And this is the dream that he had right before he got married. So I thought this was pretty interesting. So this will be obvious too. If you go through and you look these up and try to figure out who they are, it'll become very easy in time as you go through the whole thing. I went ahead and added in brackets who they are, and you'll come back to it and see that that's very credible. So it starts off, he says, after this I saw another dream, which I will now reveal to you. My son, listen carefully to my second dream that I had before I married your mother. Okay, he says, now the name of the mother here is Edna. We're not told exactly what it is. I think it's different in Hebrew. Remember, this is the Hebrew version translated into Ge'ez. Then centuries and centuries later, it's translated from Ge'ez into English. So place names are usually quite a bit different. So anyway, here's the dream. I dreamed there was a white bull that came up out of the earth. So not born by another bull or cow, but just coming up out of the earth. So we're going to see this is the symbol for creation. So this would be Adam we're talking about. Came up out of the earth. After it came up a heifer, a female bull basically appeared. There's going to be bulls, there's going to be camels, elephants, things like that. So a heifer came up, that would be Eve at this point. They're the only two. And along with the heifer came up a black bull and a red bull. Now we're going to see in this symbolism, black is usually evil, white is usually good, red is usually death or sacrifice or something like that. So you can already see where we're going. There was the first bull and the first heifer that had heifers and bulls. Some of them were black, be evil. Some of them are red, sacrificed, died, something like that. If they were green, for instance, they might be sickly or of a plague, things like that. We see the same thing with the colors of the horses in Zechariah and in Revelation. But anyway, so there came up a black bull and a red bull. So that'd be Cain and Abel. The black bull gored the red one and chased him away to the point I could no longer see the red bull. Then the black bull grew, and the heifer went with him. Now, at first, you're thinking that's Eve, but this is a different heifer. It was actually his sister. So he went with him and produced many oxen, which resembled him and followed him. So we're talking about the establishment of Cainites. And a lot of people ask that, where in the world did Cain get his wife? And the ancient texts talk about his wife was his sister. Her name was Awen. And there's a big, long story about it. But basically, they just took off, went to a place far away, and started building things. Eventually, he built the underground city called Enoch, named it after his firstborn. A lot of the two lineages have either the same names or very, very similar names. So anyway, black bull, red bull, he's gone. So then the black bull went with a heifer, created a large group of people. This group of people followed his ways. They became evil, in other words. You can see the entire history in Josephus and a general, real quick synopsis of it in the Bible. So it goes on and says, then the cow left the first bull to find the red one, but she couldn't find him and lamented greatly, but kept looking for him. I looked until the first bull came to her and quieted her, and from that time onward, she cried no more. So there was this mourning period that Eve had because she had lost both boys, basically. One had died, been executed by the other boy, and the other one banished. So then we get to the next section here. So Seth, and these are the people in Genesis chapter 5. So after this, she bore another white bull. So this is going to be a good guy, right? After him, she bore many bulls and black cows. So heifers, I think it's interesting here that he's a white bull and all the others were black. It doesn't say that specifically about the bull, but it seems like it's bulls and cows that are black or dark. So not necessarily evil, but just not godly, not super godly. So obviously the Melchizedekian priest lineage would go from Adam to Seth because he's more godly than the rest of them. So it says the white bull grew and became a great white bull. He produced many white bulls and they resembled him. So not necessarily biologically, but you've got Cain being evil, Seth being godly, and people decide who they're going to follow. Basically, two cultures develop, good guys and bad guys. So they began to beget many white bulls, which resembled them one after the other. So the colonies grew. And this is a note here about Cain being banished and taking his wife with him. And this is recorded briefly in Jubilees 4:9, Josephus 1:2:1, and other places. Okay, chapter 86. Most of these chapters are small, so we're going to take our time with it. Then I saw a star. So think about this for a minute. You've got bulls and cows, so people. White one's good, black one's bad, red one's sacrificed or dead. Now, instead of animals, something is coming from the realm of the heavens, coming down to earth. That would be angels. Angels are usually called stars, so it's not hard to figure out. In the Book of Enoch, in many places, it talks about Azazel as the one who started all the corruption with the Nephilim and things like that. So it says, then I saw a star, and this is going to end up being Azazel if you look at it carefully, fall from heaven, and it arose and ate and pastured among the cows. So it came down here and started acting like the people in some way. Just your average guy is kind of what he's trying to look like. After that, I saw large cows and black cows. So again, we've got to wonder about the translation. I would assume it'd be white and black, but large and black. And that could very easily be the fact that godly people help each other. Evil people try to destroy one another. So maybe the Sethites grew much quicker as a group than the Cainites. Anyway, we're talking about those two groups again. But it says they changed their stalls, pastures, and their young began to cry against each other. So stalls would be where they live, pastures are where they work. So basically they switched back and forth. We don't have any records that I remember of any Cainites repenting and becoming Sethites or vice versa, but we know there was some wars and other things like that recorded by Josephus. Remember, this is the earliest history of humankind. So he goes on and says, I looked towards the heaven, and behold, I saw many stars descend from heaven. So a good number of angels came down. And we remember that 200 came on Mount Hermon. So that's probably what we're talking about here. They bowed down to the first star and became bulls among the cattle and pastured among them. So this is interesting. So in other words, it's not necessarily that they all worshipped Azazel, but they emulated him. They came down and tried to do exactly what he did, only in their own way, get things started. And they became bulls. They metamorphosized. So you can see the same concept of the Nephilim history. And they worked, ate, pastured, lived among the human beings. Okay, so then it says, verse 4, they let out their sexual organs like horses do, and mounted and impregnated the cows, and the cows bore elephants, camels, and asses. So really interesting symbols here. So in a lot of these things, you're going to have nations, certain animals. So a bear, a wolf, a hyena, a dog might be Egypt or Babylon or, that kind of thing. So in this case, the stars came down, patterned themselves after Azazel, which was doing genetic experiments. The next thing you know, they became people. They had sons and daughters. But these sons and daughters basically are considered in this symbol, instead of cows, elephants, camels, and asses, or donkeys. So a couple of interesting points here is that, number one, we know from the other text, going back up in this playlist, when we talked about the Book of Giants and basic Nephilim history, that eventually there became 3 separate clans of Nephilim. That's pretty interesting to me because elephants I don't really know much about, as far as I don't see very many, if any, references to elephants in scripture or in Bible-related literature. Now, camels and donkeys we do, because donkeys and or horses, well, horses usually ride in a war. Donkeys are usually beasts of burden that carry things through regular trade routes because they have to drink a lot of water. Camels can go for long times without water, so they're usually considered the trade animals or the animals that carry things through the deserts, things like that. So it's interesting to me, though, that the camels and the donkeys in the book of Gad the seer are two major problems that go all through time and have to be destroyed at the second coming. And we link those two things with two religious powers in the end times. So it may or may not have anything to do with this, but when you see the same symbols, you always got to wonder. Anyway, so they have the cows and the stars that became cows mate together and have children, but the children are three separate clans or three separate sets of something. And in here it's elephants, camels, and donkeys. Okay, so it says the cattle feared them, began to bite and began to bite with their teeth and devour and to gore them with their horns. They began to devour those cattle, and behold, all of the children of the earth began to tremble and quake before them and flee to them. So this is a general history in symbolic form of Adam, Cain and Abel, Seth, the Sethites, the Canaanites, the 200 angels from Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, and then the three Nephilim clans, and then we're going to have the flood, and it's wiped out going forward. So, but you can see the symbolism. So cows are people, stars are angels, stars became cows, they became people. And at this point, it's other than just knowing there's three, the elephants, the donkeys, and the other camels are other things we look for. So verse 80 or chapter 87 says, then they were goring one another while they were doing this. The earth began to cry out loud. So the earth in general was distressed. So this was a major, major problem in the pre-flood world. Not just a local event, it was a major thing worldwide. I looked up to heaven and saw beings who looked like white men coming down from heaven. So white men, and this doesn't necessarily mean white as opposed to black or anything else. It's probably, going with the way this is, it's probably the original translation is wearing white robes. In other words, holy, or maybe even glowing, white glow, white light, something like that. In either case, the stars that came down and became cows are basically evil stars or evil angels, and these are holy angels. So they look like men coming down. So there's a group of them. There's actually going to be four. The first one, which we know to be Michael. Now all the way through here we have archangels listed, and it's Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel. And you see that in a lot of different manuscripts. Michael, of course, and Gabriel are mentioned in the Old and New Testaments. And then Lucifer, of course, is mentioned by name, or Hallel. King James, it's Lucifer. And then the others are not mentioned except in apocryphal literature and then a few other places. So this first one, whom will be Michael, went forth from that heaven. Then the other three followed him. The last three came and took me by the hand to a high tower. Now remember, this is a dream he's having. So he sees the four angels. Michael's getting ready to do something. The other three kind of grab him, pick him up, and take him to a tower where he can look over everything and see what's going on. This tower was far away from the children of the earth, and this very well could be a reference to Enoch's rapture. I remember also it talks about in the book of Giants, they went to try to find Enoch, and he was at the ends of the earth. So it might be something literal. It's always good to look at even the symbolic things like this for those, the symbols, and think, well, if they were literal in some sense, where would that be? From the area of Jerusalem, Mount Hermon, if you went to the ends of the earth, where might that be? Because there might be, if it's a literal place, there might be other records there. It's always something to think about. But it goes on and says, one told me, remain here until you see everything that happens to all of the elephants, camels, and asses, and the stars and the cattle. So when you see everything, they stay here until that happens. So then in chapter 88, we have what he sees for that. And this is still pre-flood. It's that Nephilim civil war. One of the first four, not Michael, but one of the others, in this case it's Raphael, because we see that in other texts, seized that first star, which had fallen from heaven, Azazel, and bound it hand and foot and cast it into an abyss. So it's gone. It's chained up. It's gone. Okay. Now, the abyss was narrow, deep, horrible, and dark. One of the other four, Gabriel, drew a sword and gave it to those elephants, camels, and asses. So he actually went forth. Your first guess on this would be he went by himself and just killed them all. But in the symbolism, since this is a dream, we're talking about he caused a civil war to occur between them. And this is what we saw in the previous lessons, that there was that Nephilim civil war. Okay, so then they began to smite each other, and the whole earth shook because of them. So this was an incredible civil war. Then one of the first four, probably Michael, gathered all the great stars whose sex organs were portrayed like horses, and bound them all hand and foot and cast them in an abyss of the earth. So Azazel is in one spot somewhere. The other 200 angels are taken together collectively and are bound somewhere else. And we know in Revelation we have 4 chained under the Euphrates. So there's different groups. Okay, and then 89. This is the flood. So we're getting up to the flood and then the post-flood area. So one of those 4 went to that white bull. So we're looking at all these things. This starts off with Adam, who's a white bull, and there's a series of white bulls all the way down. So the last one in the pre-flood world would be Noah. So he went to that white bull and instructed him in secret, or in a secret, while he was terrified. And this kind of makes sense. It goes along with the other histories. He was born a bull, but became a man. So this is really interesting, the whole idea that everybody was kind of animalistic. They did their own thing. They did what was right in their eyes. This is a guy that turned around and said, well, I have a sin nature and everything else, and I want to do this, but more importantly, I want to serve God. So he changed. He became what a man should be, what Adam should have been. So I thought that was pretty cool. So he was born a bull, but became a man and built a great vessel and dwelled in it. Now, of course, that'd have to be Noah. He built a large vessel, large ship, right? And he had 3 bulls. That obviously would be Ham, Shem, and Japheth. These 3 bulls dwelt with him in the vessel which he covered, which covered them. So in my mind, this is saying Ham, Shem, and Japheth were 3 guys. Shem was kind of godly, but probably wouldn't have went to all the trouble to try to build a boat. You know, it's just like somehow Noah, at this point anyway, was much more godly. He was a real man. The other bulls hadn't really grown up yet, so to speak. So, but they all dwelt with him in a vessel, right? They covered them or protected them. I looked up to heaven and I saw a high roof with 7 water torrents. A great amount of water flowed through those torrents into an enclosure. As I was watching, fountains were opened up on the surface of the great enclosure, and water began to swell and rise on the surface. And I watched until the enclosure until all of its surface was covered with water. So there's this massive amount of water coming from nowhere, everywhere, somewhere, and just building and building and building and building up. And so it's going to, you're getting the feeling something's going to crack and we're all going to drown here pretty quick. So it says the water, darkness, and a mist kept increasing. Now, I don't know if darkness is symbolic compared to the others or what, but that's just what the text says. The water rose above the height of the enclosure and streamed over the sides and poured upon the whole earth. And all the cattle gathered together, but eventually they were all swallowed up and perished in that water. So people went up to the high mountain tops to try to get away from it, and that worked for a little while. But eventually, when the entire planet was covered with water, they all perished. And I know some people will say if the flood of Noah was literal and it was literally over the entire planet, where did all the water go? That's a good question. Number one, it sinks into the if the continents divided and created the oceans, that's where a large part of it is. Also, we have, because of no canopy, we have extremely hot middle region on the planet and extremely two cold regions on the north and south poles. And they are frozen by I don't know how many hundreds of miles of ice. So if that's one thing everybody's worried about with the global warming, if the poles melt, we could have a worldwide flood. Maybe not everything, but it would be a disaster in the making. So those are two places, oceans and then the pole caps. Okay, so everybody perished in a flood. But the vessel floated upon a water while all the cattle, elephants, camels, and asses, along with all the other animals, sank to the bottom so that I could no longer see them. So this goes along with some of the histories in Josephus and in Enoch and other places that there are no Nephilim that made it through the flood. We do have prophecies of their technology making it through the flood, which the Book of Giants is proof of. And the fact that we're doing the things we're doing in medical science today is also proof of that same thing. So anyway, that's a different story. Eventually this fall, I'm planning on doing a post-flood Nephilim study, kind of like we did here on Enoch for the pre-flood part. There's actually lots of manuscripts to look at for that. So they were not able to escape, but perished in the depths. When the water torrents were removed from that high roof and the chasms of the earth were leveled up and the other abysses were opened, then the water began to run down into the abysses and the earth became visible. And the vessel settled on the earth and the darkness retired and light appeared. So I'm assuming storm, the darkness, and everything. So this is afterwards. Okay, so it says, but that white bull, that would have to be Noah, right? That white bull, which had become a man, came out of the vessel, and the three bulls with him. And the one of those three was white, okay, and it would be Shem. Again, no racism here. White is purity or holiness. Blue would be royalty, so red would be sacrifice or death. Black would be evil, that kind of thing. So, white bull that became a man, very unusual white bull. But then there was a white bull, a holy one, that'd be Shem, which was like the bull, Noah. Another one of them was red, that's probably Japheth with blood, because we know what happens afterwards. There's the war between the Hamites and the Japhethites, and they were slaughtered pretty heavily. And this was at the time when Nimrod takes over, builds the empire, and that kind of stuff happens. So that does fit. And one of them was black, Ham. So Ham's children would be evil. Ultimately, when the attack started in that era, it was Canaan to the coast or on the west, and then Nimrod to the east, and they basically attacked from two sides and came in and created an empire. And these were both descendants of Ham, so it does fit. Okay, so white, red, and black, and the white bull departed from them. So Noah went to live out the rest of his life elsewhere, and there are records where that's at. So That fits here also. Right now, we're just studying not so much the history, but to try to see the prophecy and how the symbols work. So when we take it into our time period, we can look at the prophecies and figure out what's going on. So it says, they began to bring forth beasts of the field and the birds and all those different species. So that's probably in the symbolism, Gentile nations. So we're going to have like wolves and bears and different types of things, and those would be like Egyptians, Babylonians, different people. So, and he gives a list here. There's lions, there's tigers, there's wolves, there's dogs, there's hyenas, wild boars, foxes, squirrels, swine, falcons, vultures, kites, eagles, ravens. And among them was born a white bull. So if we're talking about all the different factions of Gentile nations, now we're going to have a white bull, a holy nation. That's going to be Abraham. So that makes perfect sense. Now, just looking at this part, if you were to back up at this part, you'd say like, okay, that had to have been Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Seth, Nephilim, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the boat. I mean, it just kind of makes sense when you look back at it after reading it. Okay. One comment here is in again, this is the Ethiopic version, but we have parts of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are Hebrew. In the Hebrew version, this is all identical, except if I remember correctly, wolves is actually bears in the Hebrew. The rest of them are the same. I don't know if that's important, to identify. If I was going to pick something, a bear, or not a bear, yeah, a bear would be Persia. Wolves, I don't know. Lions, maybe Babylon. Tigers, I don't know. Hyenas, boars, foxes. So I don't know if that's important or not, but that's just something to think about. But one thing it does tell us is that this part of the story in the Hebrew version that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's very small. We don't have hardly anywhere near even a quarter of the book in the scrolls. But what we do have is identical. And what's also cool is anytime we come up to an actual history document that gives us the dates or ages or times between events or something like that, they always agree with the Hebrew version of the Bible, like Genesis in the King James, for instance, that kind of thing, not the Septuagint. So that's always kind of interesting to me. So we're getting down to Abraham, right? So Abraham to Joseph's time. So it says, at this time, you've got all these different nations, and that's all the different wild animals, and then the white bull. So at that point, with all of these existing, the animals begin to bite one another. So in other words, wars begin to develop between the different nations. So the white bull, Abraham, which was born among them, begot a wild ass. Now remember the prophecy that Ishmael would be a wild ass of a man, someone that's stubborn, that's untamable, that kind of thing. And a white bull, again, a holy one. That would be Isaac. So Isaac and Ishmael, according to this, could be twins, which we know they were. So with it, so there's a wild ass and a white bull with it, and the wild asses multiplied. So they become multiple donkeys, and so those are the Arab nations from Ishmaelites. But the bull, which was born from him, begat a black wild boar. Remember, he had Jacob and Esau. So the black wild boar would be the Esauites, Edomites, and a white sheep. And it's interesting to me here that we've went from the time of bulls, basically doing your own thing, to now we're sheep. So as far as nations go, so it's something has changed in that. And of course, this would be, of course, Jacob and Israel, the sheep. So you've got Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. So the former begot many boars, many children that were basically ungodly. The sheep begot 12 sheep. That would be the 12 tribes of Israel. So that makes sense. When those 12 sheep were grown, they gave up one of them to the asses. Again, I thought that was interesting. So one of them, that'd be Joseph, was sold into slavery to Ishmaelite slave traders. Those asses also gave that sheep up to the wolves. So wolves is apparently Egyptians, if we can keep going on that kind of a thing. So, but we know that's what happened. So that sheep grew up among the wolves, and the Lord brought the 11 sheep to live with it and to pasture with it among the wolves, and they multiplied and became many flocks of sheep. So the children of Israel growing strong and in Egypt. The wolves began to fear them. They oppressed them until they killed one of their little ones. They cast their young into a great river of water. That's what they did to the Hebrew children. But those sheep began to cry out loud on account of their little ones and complained to the Lord. Okay, so a sheep rose up from all these sheep, a special sheep. Of course, this is Moses. A sheep which had been saved from the wolves fled and escaped the wild asses, escaped to the wild asses. So that would be Midianites, if we're just plugging in the Bible to interpret these animals. And I saw the sheep, how they lamented and cried, besought their Lord with all their might, until the Lord of the sheep descended at the voice of the sheep from their lofty abode and came to them and pastured with them. So this is the Exodus we're talking about, the Lord coming down and delivering them from Egypt. He called that sheep which had escaped the wolves and spoke with it concerning the wolves, that it should warn them not to touch the sheep. The sheep went to the wolves according to the word of the Lord, and another sheep met it and went with it, and the two went together and entered the assembly of the wolves. That have to be Moses and Aaron. So I'm just wanting to show you this mainly because when you get into the symbolism and the prophecies that are in dream form, they're usually pretty straightforward. It's not really too complicated. If it's really, really complicated, there's usually something wrong, a mistranslation or something. Okay, so, and it goes on and says, I saw that the wolves and how they greatly oppressed the sheep with all of their power, and the sheep cried aloud. The Lord came to the sheep and began to smite those wolves, to be the 10 plagues probably, and the wolves began to make lamentation, but the sheep became quiet and ceased crying out. So the Lord took care of that. So then we have what we call the Exodus. The sheep departed from the wolves, but the eyes of the wolves were blinded, so those wolves pursued the sheep with all their power. Remember the story of the entire Egyptian army being destroyed in the Red Sea. So the Lord of the sheep went with them as their leader, and all his sheep followed him, and his face was dazzling and glorious to behold. The wolves began to pursue those sheep until they had reached a sea of water. That sea was divided, and the water stood on both sides before their eyes. And the Lord led them and took them Lord led them and stood between them and the wolves. So this is something I haven't looked at too much, but this whole idea, his face was dazzling, that could be symbolic of protection or something. So there's other things in here that if the symbols are consistently repeated, we can learn some new symbols. And then when we get to Revelation, maybe something else will make sense. Okay, so it says, even those wolves could not see the sheep, they proceeded to the midst of the sea, following them. And when they saw the Lord of the sheep, they turned to flee, but the sea gathered itself together, and it became as it had been created, drowning those wolves. So that's what happened to the Egyptians. We understand that. But the sheep escaped from that water and prevailed to the wilderness, where there was no water or grass. And they began to open their eyes and see, and saw the Lord of the sheep pasturing them, and giving them water and grass. So again, sheep eat water and grass. It's basically food and water. The Lord took care of them out in the wilderness. And that sheep going and leading them, which would be Moses, that sheep ascended to the summit of a lofty rock, and the Lord of the sheep sent it to them. And so now we're getting the Ten Commandments, the law, and the development of the nation of Israel. It says, after this I saw the Lord of the sheep who stood before them, and his appearance was great, terrible, and majestic. All those sheep saw him and were afraid before his face. They all feared and trembled because of him, and they cried out to that sheep with them, we are not able to stand before the Lord or behold him. So that sheep then led them again and ascended to the summit of that rock, and the sheep began to be blinded and wander from the way which he had showed them, but the sheep did not know it. The Lord of the sheep was enraged at them, and that sheep discovered it and went down from the summit of the rock and came to the sheep and found the greatest part of them blinded and fallen away. When they saw it, they feared and trembled at its presence and desired to turn to their folds. And that sheep took other sheep with it and came to those sheep that had fallen away and began to slay them. The sheep feared its presence, and thus that sheep brought back those sheep that had fallen away, and they returned to their folds. So this is all basic Exodus. So then we've got the 40 years in the wilderness. Then I saw in this vision that the sheep, Moses, became a man. Again, he's turned from his sin nature, became godly like Abraham, totally dedicated to the Lord. And he built a house to be the nation of Israel for the Lord of the sheep and placed all the sheep in that house. And I saw until this sheep had met with the sheep which led them, died. Remember, they were 40 years in the wilderness. And I saw until all of the sheep died, and the little ones arose in their place. And they came to a pasture and approached a stream of water. Then that sheep, their leader, who had become a man, withdrew from them and died, and all the sheep sought it and cried over it greatly. I saw until they stopped crying for that sheep and crossed the stream of water, where there arose other sheep as leaders in the place of those which had led them and fallen asleep, like Joshua through Judges. That's that entire period. The sheep came to a good place, a pleasant and glorious land, and I saw all those sheep were satisfied, and the house stood among them in the pleasant land. So this is the establishment of Israel. Judges period. So, and sometimes their eyes were opened, and sometimes they were blinded, until another sheep arose and led them and brought them all back, and their eyes were opened. So you've got that kind of thing going back and forth during Joshua and Judges. So then we get to Saul and David, so the united monarchy and the establishment of the temple. So then there were dogs, the Philistines, and foxes, probably Ammonites and Moabites, and wild boars, we know Edom and Amalek, began to devour those sheep, and the Lord of the sheep raised up a ram, to be King Saul, from their midst to lead them. So it's interesting to think sheep need protection. A ram is something that will probably kill you if you get in its way, but it's still a sheep, kind of, as opposed to the bulls and the wild boars and that kind of stuff. So that ram began to butt the dogs, the foxes, the wild boars, until it had destroyed them all. And that sheep, which is probably Samuel, whose eyes were opened, saw that ram which was amongst the sheep, until it forsook its glory and began to butt those sheep and trampled upon them. and behaved itself unseemly. So in here, sheep are the people of God, not necessarily somebody that rises up and attacks and kills, but a ram is someone, it's a sheep that rises up, attacks, and kills. Could be good, could be bad, depending if it's black or white or red. Red would be it's losing the war. So later on, when we see a sheep or a ram that becomes evil, it's very important for us to remember that symbolism. So then, David's time. It says, the Lord of the sheep sent the sheep to a lamb, a baby sheep, okay, and raised it up to be a ram. It's not raised to be a sheep, it's raised to be a ram. And the leader of the sheep, instead of that ram which had forsaken its glory, it went to it and spoke to it alone. It raised it to be a ram and made it a prince and a leader of the sheep. During all of these things, those dogs, the Philistines, oppressed the sheep. The first ram pursued the second ram, and the second ram arose and fled from before it. And I saw until those dogs pulled down the first ram. The second ram rose up and led the sheep. Those sheep grew and multiplied, but all the dogs, foxes, so Philistines, Ammonites, and Moabites, wild boars, Edom and Amalek, feared and fled from him. That ram butted and killed the wild beasts. That ram begot many sheep and then fell asleep. So that's King David's legacy. So his actual person that takes over, of course, is Solomon. It says, and a little sheep became a prince and a leader of those sheep. And that house, which is the nation of Israel, became great and broad and was built for those sheep, and a great and lofty tower, that'd be Solomon's temple, was built on the house for the Lord of the sheep. And the house was low, but the tower was elevated and lofty. And the Lord of the sheep stood on that tower, and they offered a full table before him. So now we have the sacrifices in the temple and those things. So, the time of the prophets. Those sheep again erred and went many ways, and they forsook their house. And the Lord of the sheep called from amongst some of the sheep, prophets, and sent them to the sheep, and the sheep began to slay them. Always happens with prophets. Okay, and then the school of Elijah begins. One of them, this would be Elijah, was saved and not slain. And it was sped away, and it cried aloud over the sheep, and they sought to kill it. But the Lord of the sheep saved it from the sheep, brought it up to me. Remember, this is Enoch talking. So Elijah apparently is raptured like Enoch was, and caused it to dwell here. He sent many other sheep to those sheep to testify to them and lament over them. Okay, then we have the split kingdom. After that, I saw when they forsook the house of the Lord and his tower, they fell away entirely, and their eyes were blinded. And I saw that the Lord of the sheep, how he wrought much slaughter amongst them in their herds, until those sheep invited that slaughter and betrayed his place. And then we're getting toward the end of our thing for today. Just wanted to catch up to the time of the 70 shepherds. So this is really important when they come back from Babylon. So he gave them over to the hands of lions and tigers. Assumably that's Assyria and Babylon, which makes sense. Lion would be Babylon. Tigers, never really saw that before, but again, really interesting. Wolves, hyenas, and the hand of the foxes and the wild beasts, and those wild beasts began to tear those sheep into pieces. So there's this major war going on for many, many factions. I saw that Yahweh left the house and the tower and gave it to the hands of the lions, that have to be Babylonians, and they should tear down and destroy them. So I began to cry aloud with all my power and appeal to the Lord of the sheep in regard of the sheep. But he remained unmoved, though he saw it. And rejoiced that they were devoured, swallowed, and robbed. He left them in the hands of those beasts for food. So we're going to stop there tonight. And then next time we're going to get to this section on the 70 shepherds. So far we've seen the dream go from Adam through the Nephilim, through Noah, through Shem, down to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, down to Moses. We've seen different animals representing different kinds of nations. They're all Gentile nations. But then Israel gets started, and then everybody's sheep instead of bulls. So it's a different time period. We've went from the time of creation, or the age of creation, to the age of Torah. So now we're getting to the point where we're going all the way down through Solomon's temple, and it's destroyed because of the Babylonians. So this next section, which we'll look at next week, is going to be about when they come back, and he will actually have a listing of how many kings, how many rulers, how it works, down to it looks like he's off in 2 places. But then when we look at history, we realize the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the Roman Empire fills those 2 gaps. So again, it's an absolute perfect prophecy. So again, at this point, you could say, well, this is somebody that just made this story up. Nice fiction writer. But when you go from the 70 shepherds, there's no way you could have, in the 2nd century BC or before, figured out what happens with the Romans and the Bar Kokhba rebellion 200 years, 300 years later. And the interesting thing about it is the last section is there's a break. And so Israel is gone until 1948. And then it gives us some very detailed prophecies about what happens to Israel after 1948. And again, if any of those are exact and real, this whole thing has to be an actual prophecy, not fiction. So we'll see that in the coming weeks. But we'll stop here at this point. So let me go to the chat room, and we'll see if we have any questions. Okay, it looks like Virginia Travis became a member. Angel, thank you for supporting us. Thank you to all you guys that donate through GiveSendGo and PayPal and through YouTube. It helps us a lot. Thank you very much. Okay, she asked a question. Good evening, Brother Johnson, newcomer here. One question. Are the 2 witnesses olive trees in Revelation 11 the same as the 2 olive trees in Zechariah 4? Thank you. That's a big debate that people have. I think that they are the same, or if they're different, they represent the exact same thing. It's too close. That's one chapter that's 2 witnesses, 2 olive trees. In another chapter, you have 4 horsemen that are the same color as the 4 horsemen of Revelation. And then you have all these things like the 7-sided stone, which represents the 7 churches in Revelation. And then you have Joshua, which is the prophecy mentioned in Matthew. So there are so many prophecies in those first 8 visions of Zechariah that are partially fulfilled in the first coming and point to things in the second coming, the building of the temple and other things like that. So I wouldn't necessarily say they are exactly the same thing, but at least they show the same thing. In other words, if it's Joshua and Zerubbabel, the 2 sons of new oil in Zechariah, then there's going to be 2 witnesses doing the exact same thing. Maybe not Joshua and Zerubbabel. Maybe it's Enoch and Elijah, or Moses and Elijah, or 2 other people. So not necessarily identical, but the same thing. Just like John the Baptist was Elijah, or could have been Elijah, recovering the hearts to the fathers. Not so much Elijah, but doing what Elijah did or will do. which is an interesting prophecy. So, yeah, I think they're directly connected. And when we want to try to figure this stuff in, we need to plug in Zechariah's four horsemen with Revelation, these two witnesses, Zechariah's with Revelation, and it actually begins to explain a lot of things. Great question. Thank you. And David Ben Joseph became a member, Angel. Thank you very much. Appreciate you being here and doing that. Super chat, $100. Thank you very, very much. That is fantastic. When Cain was banished from the face of the earth, did he go underground and start all of the races in a hollow earth? Could there still be people down there today, or any good or at all evil? Well, based on what we read here, and again, that's if it's translated right, because it was Hebrew to Ethiopic to English, it looks like everybody except for the people on board the ark were destroyed. So no Nephilim, no nothing. That may not be true, though. So it's just a guess on our part. I don't know anything about a hollow earth. However, some of the texts talk about the city of Enoch that Cain built is actually supposed to be an underground city. And the entrance used to be, I don't know if it's even around anymore, but the entrance used to be in the Anti-Lebanese mountains. So if you go up to Lebanon, that part of the mountain range on the other side that almost nobody has even looked at, nobody's really researched it or even mapped it out. It's supposed to be up there somewhere. And again, that's if those are translated right. Many times you have some old text that says something like that, and you go try to find it and it's not there, and it's because it's mistranslated or part of it is fiction. So I think of Schliemann, who decided that Troy was a real place and he was going to go find it, and he memorized the Iliad and Homer and the Old and New Testaments in the languages, and everybody laughed at him like, you're a nut. Act like you can't go find the tree that Goldilocks and the three bears ate the porridge in. It doesn't exist, you know. But in his mind, it's like, no, it exists. There's too much evidence of the language pieces in different places. I will find it. And of course, he found it. So that's one of those things you have to go through. And, you know, it's really amazing to see that. But I think that could be there today. So there could be at least ruins in there. Maybe some of the pre-flood language. Who knows what else could be there? So, good question. I was told you had a video on Daniel 9 explaining how the word time means year, like 3.5. Could you explain that or point me to the video? We should have one on YouTube. We do have a Rumble channel also for videos that might be controversial. I've only gotten in trouble with YouTube. Yeah, YouTube it was, once, a long time ago. I had talked about a prophecy and I described how it was fulfilled. And I used a biblical term to describe it, and then told you what that biblical term was or which country it was. And they basically came back and said, that's hate speech. You can't say stuff like that, which I didn't really. I was quoting the Bible. So that's spooky if you think about telling God that he can't say something that's hate speech. Anyway, so things like that, if I might get in trouble, we have over there or on our network. But yeah, you're probably talking about in Daniel 12. It's a different issue. In Daniel 12, it talks about the 1290, 1260, and the 1335. And that points to a very clear pre-trib rapture text. In Daniel 9, though, talking about that, there's the time period. That's probably the one you're thinking of, and I don't have that on YouTube. I'm going to go back eventually and recreate it and just look at the numbers and not say too much about anything else so that it's in pieces, so nobody will be offended. But in Daniel 9, it talks about decree, and it goes forth so many days, and that's when the Messiah is cut off. And it agrees with Dead Sea Scroll 11Q13 on the exact date. but you can get that down to the day. So it's really fascinating. And most people don't know it. And again, the one where I did that, that's over on Rumble, because YouTube didn't like it. It actually talks about three dates. There's 32 AD, 1948 AD, and then 1967 AD. And all those three come from Daniel. When you learn how the calendar system works, they give the exact date on when the Messiah would be cut off, when the nation of Israel would be reborn, and when they would take back the Temple Mount. See, that's what gets me in trouble. They were supposed to take it back, or maybe not, or if I say something like that, I'm taking sides in a war, you know. So it's kind of strange out there. Anyway, so you can look at those dates, though. The dates come out to be the exact dates on when those certain events occurred. And so that's what's really fascinating about it. We try not to set dates, definitely not the rapture. But if there was something predicted and that's over now, it either happened or it didn't. And if it did, we want to mention that to people. It's faith building, you know, and if it didn't, then we had it wrong. So just like that. So that would be in that case. So if it is appointed for a man once to die and then the judgment, are the two witnesses the only two men who never died? As far as I know, there's some Jewish legends of others, but that's out of the Talmud, so it doesn't, you know, it's probably not correct. But if Enoch and Elijah are the two witnesses, literally come back, and then the two witnesses are killed, as it says in Revelation, that means everybody dies somewhere along the line. So that's kind of interesting as far as being appointed once to die. Of course, that could be an exception too. That's a good question. James Stark became a member, angel level. Thank you again very much for joining us. Jubilees says the ends of the earth are where Enoch was taken. Where Enoch was taken was the Garden of Eden. If we found that location, could there still be writing, or maybe buried in walls? Could there be pillars of stone? Yeah, definitely possibility. Anything like that we need to look at, like when the Jews fled to Pella, or not the Jews, the believing Jews, the Christians, fled to Pella right before the destruction of the temple. And that place has never been excavated to my knowledge. So what kind of maybe original books of Matthew or Paul could actually be there? Or maybe not originals, but very, very close to the originals, like within a decade or something. Could be very interesting. You never know what might still be around. If we have copies of the Old Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls that are 200 BC, I think something from 70 AD could still be around. So very, very fascinating. Where do Neanderthals fit in? My understanding is that their DNA is different from us, yet they are considered human. I've read, and I'm not the great scientist type guy, but I have read several reports about they're different, all the different types of that. And I've also read in a lot of Christian Science groups that the DNA and radiocarbon dating and stuff like that can be faulty, and they kind of pick what fits best. There was a Biblical Archaeology magazine had an article back in the 80s, and they did some DNA testing. Now, again, back then it wasn't nearly as accurate as now, so I don't know. But they were saying that the Neanderthal were basically Homo sapiens, just like us, but they had, through inbreeding, developed rickets. And that's a severe type of arthritis. It makes your bones in your face protrude, and so they would look strange if they all had rickets or something like that, some sort of arthritis. So I'm not really sure. I would assume the bottom line is they're either humans that developed a weird disease and that's why they look different, or they're genetically so different that they could not intermingle with humans, in which case they'd be Nephilim, like the Peruvian skulls. The preliminary DNA evidence From what I've heard, again, I don't do DNA testing, but from what I've heard, people like L.A. Marzulli and other people that have looked at that have said, yeah, it's a totally different species. Neanderthals might not be. But it's fascinating to look at, though, because we should have both, humans with problems and non-humans with problems. Watchers witnessed their children, Nephilim, killed one another, so they were still some survived and then died during the flood. Oh, yeah, according to the text, we've think we've covered that in this section. This will end up being a playlist on YouTube and other places. But the other parts of the Jubilees, Enoch, and the Book of Giants and other scrolls basically say that the punishment was for them to be chained or bound. They can't really do anything. They have to just sit there and watch. And so they're kind of bound, and they have to watch the destruction, the civil war of their creation. And then they were chained in darkness. So that's basically the story that we're given. Again, I would really love to get the Hebrew version. It may be slightly different, Second Samuel says Saul's descendants were killed to satisfy God's wrath due to Saul's now long dead sin against the Gibeonites. How is it just that 7 innocent men died for Saul's sin? It would not be if they were innocent men. It's probably, and again, we need the rest of the story. It's probably talking about 7 men that sided with Saul. And if they had the opportunity, they would do the same thing. And so any kind of a clan like that, you want wiped out. I don't know that that's the case, but that would fit knowing God's mercy and the whole idea that a son is not put to death for what the father does. That's just part of the law, which had already been in effect at that point. Super chat, $10. Working my way through your Book of Jasher, my pastor's favorite Ken Johnson book. Great. You have a book on the founders of our country. Yes. Not sure the title. Might be my next purchase. Thank you. Yes, it's called The Bible, the Constitution, and the Founding Fathers. So I'm glad your pastor likes it. Thank you all for buying the books and giving them out. And several of you on our network are starting Bible studies in your churches and in your homes on the scrolls, going back through stuff. So it's fantastic to see the information getting out. The Silent One became a member. Archangel, thank you very much. Glad to have you here. Even though you're the silent one, hopefully you will say something. Okay, see here. Did I not do that right? Became a member. Angel, okay. George did. Thank you very much. I'm not doing something right here. There we go. Okay. When was the Book of Enoch supposed to have been first written? Well, if you believe the text, it's written by Enoch, so it'd be pre-flood. That would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 2600 BC, something like that. It has obviously been at least retranslated for like place names. And then, of course, the one that we have is the Ethiopic. The Ethiopic version would have to be after. Well, actually, that's not true either. It would at least be 1st or 2nd century AD when they put it in their canon. But then the Philosopher Jews, their history goes back to about 1000 AD, BC. So somewhere back in there, they would have had it in their other canon. So somewhere in that neighborhood. The oldest text we have is probably from the Ethiopian, which is probably 100 or 200 AD. The fragments we have in the scrolls date to about 200 BC. And then other texts will quote it, showing that it does go back further somewhere along that line. Super chat, $10. Thank you very much. Became a member, level Seraph. Thank you very much. Glad you guys are on board with us. Thank you for helping out. God asked Daniel to seal the prophecy. What does that mean? I think it means basically just like if you think of a last will and testament. So I write my last will and testament. Nobody's supposed to see it until after my death. So it's sealed and given to somebody who will hold it, like my lawyer or someone, somebody in a trust or somewhere. And they'll hold it and not let anybody mess with it or even look at it until after I'm dead. So when there's a death report and it's official, then they will open it up and read it. And whoever gets whatever, they will call those people, read it to them in their presence, and after that it becomes public. So sealed is kind of like wrapped up, sealed with a seal of some sort for the purpose of being set aside. It's to be protected, saved. Nobody's supposed to look at it until the right time. And so that's what they're talking about there. There's a specific prophecy, and that's one thing that, as most of our Christian brothers and sisters misread this. If it's sealed, then we can never know what it means. That's not what it says. It's sealed in his time period so that someone else gets it later. Why that would be, I don't know, but somewhere along the line it is revealed. May or may not have been done yet, but those are things to look at. Anything like that always makes me curious. Like, what is it? When will we figure it out? Greetings, new to the channel, welcome. Old follower of your work, if appropriate, I thought Ezekiel 39 and 38 should be separated. 39 before the wrath, 38 near or after the 70th week. Have you heard of this? Yeah, there's several different ways of doing that. Most people believe 38 and 39 are the same war. Other people would divide the two. And then some people would say one of them is sometime on our side, either during the tribulation, before, after, somewhere, and the other one, the one mentioned in Revelation, which is at the end of the millennial reign. And then some people will make the millennial reign one 39, others will make it 38. So nobody seems to know for sure. And if it's a name in general, we could theoretically have two down here and one at the end of Revelation. So it's one of those things that we don't have enough information to really look at. But there's a lot of interesting theories about that. So thank you for mentioning that. So the Nephilim died before the flood since they killed each other. Yeah, that was the curse. The Lord sent confusion amongst them. And you see that all the way through the Old Testament, where someone decides to attack Israel, and the Lord makes one half of the army think the other half of the army is Israel. Both sides do that, and they attack each other and destroy each other. You see that actually in Ezekiel 38 toward the end. He will send confusion, and they will attack each other. So it's a kind of a standard thing. When you can't defend yourself and the Lord steps in, he usually does something like that rather than sending a bunch of angels. But he could do either or. So in that case, we're told that's how they ended also. Matthew 27 records the saints rising from the dead at Jesus' death. Is there any ancient writing that tells us of this and what happened to them? There are a few comments in the church fathers, and there's not enough to really pull together. One of the comments, and I believe this also, because one of the questions that was raised to me a long time ago is some people were resurrected, and whatever happened, happened, you know. And then you get to the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, Peter's giving a sermon, and he makes a point of saying David is here still in his tomb. So the question arises, well, David was a man after God's own heart. Why wouldn't David be resurrected? You know, or was he? And Peter was mistaken, or is it translated wrong? You know, whatever. So lots of questions like that. And my theory, and I get this from one of the church fathers who doesn't exactly say this, but he comes close to saying this, is that they didn't have pictures and statues in Israel. That was kind of forbidden. So normally you didn't have that. So if David would have resurrected, Then you have this little guy running around claiming to be King David. Nobody's seen him before, and nobody's going to pay any attention to him, right? On the other hand, we all know we've all buried our moms, our dads, some brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles. We were with them years and years, and now all of a sudden they're standing here. You give me 5 minutes to talk to them, I'll know if it's really them or not. Sure enough, it's them. But I was there when we buried them, and now they're talking about Jesus Christ. That would be a phenomenal witness, the people that we all know. And that can't be very many people. It's just a handful of people that everybody would have known. And I think that's probably what's going on as an eyewitness type situation. But again, that's iffy. There's no text that actually says that to that point. So not exactly sure. Became a member, Seraph. Okay, great. Welcome aboard. Okay, yeah, and remember, if you're a Seraph, one of the things is the new books that we have. Whenever we come out with a new book, Seraphs get a PDF copy of that, so you can look online and find out. Just really appreciate all you guys that give a little extra and support us throughout the years, and it's definitely worth it. Since the Nephilim died, well, our last question here, where do the giants reported still alive in Iraq come from? Long story short, and we'll get into that this fall, the post-flood Nephilim. So they were all died and wiped out, but they left records of how they did the genetic tampering. And in this course on YouTube, but just stay in the Enoch course. If you go back, we've got, I think, 2 of them on the Book of Giants. But one of them talks about, so it's a Dead Sea Scroll explaining how you do genetic splicing, that kind of a thing. And it seems to be accurate. So we have another historical writing that says that Canaan quietly went up to Zidon, formed a settlement, which is about as close as you can get on the coast to go straight into Mount Hermon, which was known to be where they originated from. And he found written records. He took them back quietly and started doing experiments. The next thing you know is you have giants in the land of Canaan, and then they were driven out and destroyed by Joshua during that time period. And some of them fled, to the Americas and then down south, and others went to Iraq and different places, according to some of the scrolls or some of the other histories. So basically, it's not a new incursion, or doesn't have to be anyway. That may have happened also, but there's no written record of it that I know of. But the written records say that they just found how to do it. Once you know this is poison, that's not, and you mix it together and this happens, you can kind of like cooking. I probably couldn't make a cake, but if I had detailed instructions and all this stuff, I might be able to make a decent cake. And with a little bit of practice, probably make a really good one. So the same kind of stuff. They're just following directions in the text. So if you want to, go back and on this playlist and look at the Book of Giants part. Okay, we'll go ahead and stop there for tonight. We've had, one more. A network. Okay, yeah. Let me flop over to that too. So here's another way of doing it if you want to scan that. I need to start putting this up. So here's our Bible Fats network. There's certain things that are not allowed to be talked about in certain ways on Facebook and YouTube and, most of those, Instagram, and that's fine. It's their place and they have their rules. So one of the things we did is we created a Mighty Networks network. It's kind of like a Facebook thing where we can get in there and chat. We don't allow people to come in, post pornography, cuss, teach really weird stuff or anything. But if you want to come in and talk about Nephilim, have questions about stuff, then that's perfectly fine. We've got about 1,300 members in there, and so it's free. So it's our our Facebook replacement, so to speak. So, but that's for that one there. And then we also have, try to do both of those. If you want to support our ministry through Give, Send, Go, you can do that also there. So let's see. Do we have an extra one? Okay, I guess that's it. All right, well, I'll just go back to this then. So if I can learn how to turn this back off. There we go. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there for tonight, and we'll pick back up next week. Next week, we want to slow down and just look at basically 4 pages or so, looking at how this works, the symbolism, and we'll see how everything was predicted all the way up to the Bar Kokhba rebellion. It's got a really interesting twist in it. And then the more prophecy we look at with the symbols and know exactly what happened because it's all history, then we get to the 1948 forward part, and it's still a little guesswork, I guess, but very, very interesting. So we'll pick up on that next week. God bless you guys, and we will see you next week.